Let's just talk a little bit about Ted and Lola here at Lola's Place. And to help us do that and to get a sense of what it was all like, we're going to hear an excerpt from Lola's autobiography that she co-wrote with Susie Sparks. And Susie Sparks is going to read a little bit of that for us right now. So ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Susie Sparks to read a bit from the book. Come on up, Susie.
Being here with us this evening, and I guarantee that given the chance, she would have been the one up here telling all the stories about the wonderful people who made this evening possible. Not Ted, for as gregarious as Lola was, Ted was equally reserved. She used to say, "You cannot imagine how different our backgrounds were. I had grown up with 6 closely spaced siblings, noisy, laughing, singing, storytelling, fun-loving family. We were the preacher's kids. We were wrapped up in a close, nurturing bond that was made even stronger by the church communities we lived among and who cared for us all of our lives." Ted, on the other hand, had been raised by parents whose 2 primary values were education and hard work. So even though Ted had earned a scholarship to Michigan Tech during the hardest years of the Depression, he had to get in and out of there fast because there was no money to keep him any longer than absolutely necessary. He managed to cram his 4 years into 2.5. But the preacher, thanks to his church connections in East Texas, was able to negotiate college educations for all 7 of his children. And Lola enrolled at Trinity University, which was then in Waxahachie. She said, "By the end of my first term in June, Preacher had found me a job at a Christian camp in North Texas for the first couple of weeks of July, which was okay because Charlie, my boyfriend, he was at football camp all summer, and we'd arranged that we could meet back at Trinity after my job at the camp was over. I could work evenings in the dining hall, and then we could see one another every night." But Papa interfered. When I finished at the camp, he announced I'd have to go spend the next 6 weeks at my sister Ann's in Olney. She was a new bride and needed some company. I was devastated. Why did I need to go babysit Ann? She was a grown woman. She could find her own friends. I wanted to go back to Trinity to be with Charlie, but there was no way I could budge Preacher once he got an idea into his head. Ann and Ed took pity on me as I moped around missing Charlie with nothing to do, so finally they planned a bridge party to introduce me to some of their friends. I, of course, had never dealt a hand of cards in my life because that was another of Preacher's taboos, but Ed said he had met a fellow on one of the seismic crews outside of town who knew how to play, and he could teach me. I'm sure I wasn't exactly pouting about having to entertain some friend of Ed's, but I'm equally sure I wasn't looking forward to a boring evening with my married sister's married couples bridge club. I helped Ann fix something for her share of the potluck, and the couple started arriving and introductions were made, and as Ann and I were setting up the tables, there was another knock at the door. Ed went to answer it, and just as I turned around, in walked the spitting image of Errol Flynn. He had come right from the golf course, tall, tan, curly hair, beige suit, yellow tie. "Lola," said Ed, "I'd like you to meet my friend Ted Rosé. He's working on Shell's seismic crew just outside of town, and he tells me he's a bridge player." I was speechless, totally smitten. 3 weeks later, Ted proposed. Before I had a chance to accept, he immediately launched into all the reasons I shouldn't marry him. Life on a seismic crew is unsettled. It's a constant migration from one dusty little community to the next. The move to a new field comes every 6 weeks or 3 months, and there'll be times you'll have to spend alone because they're on places where there's no housing of any kind. And I had to interrupt him to say yes. I was 19. Ted was 24. From that point forward, it was exactly as Ted had promised. On the day he and Lola were married, 2 days after the Nazis invaded Poland in September of 1939, they moved with Shell's seismic crews to Stroud, Oklahoma, and the hunt for oil shifted into overdrive. Through the next 10 years, they moved from Stroud to Winfield, Kansas, to Bristow, Oklahoma, to Decatur, Texas, to Olney, Texas, where Ruth Ann was born, to Jacksboro, Texas, to Midland, Texas, to Vandalia, Illinois, to Bay City, Michigan, to Grand Rapids, Michigan, to Alma, Michigan, to Flint, Michigan, back to Bay City, Michigan, back to Midland, Texas, to Jackson, Mississippi, where young Ted was born, to New Orleans, where Lola discovered Cajun cooking and Ted discovered classical music, then to Baton Rouge. When we arrived in Baton Rouge, I offered up a silent prayer that Ruthie could at least finish the 2nd grade before we had to move again. But when Ted came home in April of 1949 with that look in his eye, I knew we were at it again. This time, though, he made me sit down before he'd tell me where we were going. Calgary? Where's Calgary? In Alberta. Where's Alberta? In Canada. There's oil in Canada? We'll only be there a year. Imperial found something in a little place called Leduc and another called Redwater. Shell just wants us to have another look. A year. They promised we wouldn't have to stay longer than a year. Yes, absolutely. There's some issue with Canadian currency. American employees can't be paid longer than a year in Canada. Thankfully, her new Canadian neighbors schooled Lola through the challenges of life in the frigid north that winter, and she stepped right into her new community, looking to find where she could be helpful. Her first stop, of course, was Grace Presbyterian Church, where Lola sang in the choir and was up to her elbows in the ladies' volunteer work. Ted, though, pretty quickly realized the enormous potential of the energy industry in Alberta and decided before they'd even been there a year that he could just as easily contract his services back to Shell. You want to leave the company? You want to leave Shell, but you want to stay here? Ted was talking fast, and I was trying to stay composed enough to decipher what it was he was trying to tell me. You're saying you want to leave Shell, start your own seismic company, and then contract your services back to Shell? I kept looking out through the frost on the window as we sat together at the kitchen table, his voice now drowned out by the noise in my head. What in the world was he thinking? If he wanted to, didn't he know how lucky we were? We had a secure job with a great future. If he wanted to start his own company, why wouldn't we just go back to Texas to do that? And how could he start his own company? Even I knew how expensive a proposition that would be. And if he could, who would he hire? Everybody we knew was tied up with the big oil companies. This was crazy. Maybe if I was perfectly calm, I could get through to him. Won't Shell want this house back if you leave the company? Yes, I thought so. Not only would we be penniless, we'd be sleeping on the street. I glanced at the thermometer hanging outside the window frame. If I was reading it correctly, through the frost, it was 37 below. But Ted figured it was a gamble with good enough odds to give it his best shot. So armed with a folding table and 2 chairs, he moved into 2 bare rooms he'd found at the back of the Uptown Theater on 8th Avenue. Then, quite quickly, it all began to pay off. Within a year, Frontier grew to 5 crews. As Frontier began to prosper, Ted had a little more time to enjoy life, and he started a pretty serious study of classical music. He and Lola regularly attended the Calgary Orchestra, and through the years, Ted and Lola both volunteered to help them grow. Ted had become a board member of the early Philharmonic Orchestra, and Lola volunteered to help with the very first Benny the Bookworm sale. It was the Rosés, along with many other new Calgarians, who were a very large part responsible for our world-class symphony orchestra. And Ted helped to make it possible to bring Mario Bernardi to the Calgary Philharmonic through the Maestro's Endowment Fund. But it was Lola who was responsible for bringing this beautiful Rosé Center to the University of Calgary. She said, by this time the university had matured and it boasted excellent professional schools of law and business and medicine and engineering. But because the university had grown so quickly, the undergraduate programs, particularly those of the fine arts, were the poor stepchildren of the very powerful graduate faculties. Dean Roberts was our guide on our U of C field trip, and he wanted us to know how they were hoping to support the development of the arts faculty. As we wandered through the building, I could hear the music of the horns and violins and cellos coming at us from different directions, and I assumed we were getting close to their practice studios. But finally I had to ask, where are the students practicing? Dean Roberts said, follow me, and led us down the hall to the stairwell door, opened it, and motioned me inside. From my spot on the landing, I could see up one flight of stairs and down another. A student sat on each landing, perched atop his backpack, his instrument poised, pausing only for a brief look at his intruders. When I stepped back into the hallway and the music started again, I said, are your studios full? Is that why you're practicing in the stairwells? It was his answer that opened the door to what would eventually become this Rosé Center for the Performing Arts, both at the University of Calgary and 3 years later at Michigan Tech, Ted's alma mater. Lola's contagious enthusiasm brought in all the other many contributors, but Ted always knew that it was her wonderful people skills that would seal the deal. She was genuinely interested in everyone's story and equally intent upon finding out what was important to them in their lives. So, if Lola were here this evening, she would undoubtedly greet you all by name. And I'm pretty sure she might echo the words she said to me when we first started talking about writing her book. It's time to tell our story, she said. I'll try to show how Ted and I had the privilege of a charmed life, how we found one another in the depth of the Depression, and how we started with nothing except the values gifted to us by generations of hardworking, honest, and loving people. How they taught us that it's not what a man has or even what he does that expresses his worth. It's whether he has a kind and generous soul and tries to live this world a little better than he found it. I'm so glad you could all be here this evening to celebrate this wonderful anniversary of the Rozsa Foundation. And I know for sure that Lola would want to welcome each of you personally, just as she did in 1912 at the 10th anniversary of the Rozsa Award.